Howdy folks, Dominic here. Today we introduce a most famous monument, the Temple of Abu Simbel, constructed for Ramesses II and his primary wife, Nefertari. It's quite a large monument with multiple parts, so to keep things orderly, today I'm just focusing on the Great Temple, the one dedicated to the king, and I'm going to focus on the historical components, the temple's function, conception, construction, and the famous solar alignment that happens twice a year. In a future episode, I'll talk about the Temple of Nefertari, which is right next to the King's Monument. And for those interested in the visual side of things, like the colossal statues, the art, and the overall vibes of the temple, I'll be doing a live stream about that later in 2025, using a 3D model that is available online, so we can explore the temple in person, so to speak. If you want to see that, simply subscribe to my YouTube channel. There'll be a link in the episode description. Otherwise, enjoy the episode. One day, around 1286 BCE, a great ship sailed upriver along the Nile. It was made of cedar wood, with a sail of red and green fabric, and a cabin amidships, decorated in gold, silver, and gems. This royal barge belonged to Egypt's pharaoh, Wasmuria Satepnaria Ramesses, known today as Ramesses II. The king was taking a trip southward, into the land of Nubia. It was now regnal year 6, and the king was busy with new projects. Along the Nile Valley, temples were rising, and older monuments were covered in scaffolding or surrounded by mud brick ramps, as countless builders added new structures. It was a works program of tremendous proportions, not since the days of Amenhotep III of Dynasty 18, or perhaps even Sneferu of Dynasty 4, had something equivalent occurred. The builders of Egypt were working on a scale not seen in generations. Now, the pharaoh was going to start something truly special. The royal barge approached a promontory on the west bank of the river. Here, a great mountain emerged sharply from the waters and curved northward, following the contours of the river. Made of sandstone, it bore the unmistakable lines of sediment, accumulated horizontally in thick bands. On its eastern face, the mountain presented a sharp drop as it overlooked the river. This was a mountain that we know as Abu Simbel. Waiting on the bank, a high official was prepared to welcome the king. He was well dressed, in fine linens and jewellery, and his entourage was sizable, consisting of secretaries, assistants, soldier bodyguards, and various hangers-on. The man's name was Iyuni, possibly pronounced Oni, and he was a high-ranking member of the government. Iyuni held the title of Sa Nesu en Kash, or the King's Son of Kush, commonly known today as the Viceroy of Nubia. One of the most powerful officials, Iyuni managed the business of Egypt's southern colonial empire. They oversaw the fortresses, the temples and towns, the gold mines and trade routes, and they took responsibility for security. The viceroys of Kush and their local government ruled Nubia on behalf of the crown. Naturally, this also involved building projects, and as the royal barge tied up at the base of the mountain, Iyuni's scribes, maybe architects, were ready to present a plan. According to inscriptions at Abu Simbel itself, the mountain was chosen as a sacred site for a god. That deity was Horus, the lord of kingship, specifically a version of Horus called Kher Neb Mecha, or Horus the Lord of Mecha. Mecha was the region in which Abu Simbel is located, and you can find references to Horus, Lord of Mecha, at nearby temples, but the mountain itself was apparently viewed as the god's domain. What better place for a new kingly monument? The plan was simple enough in concept. Abu Simbel has all the standard features of a New Kingdom temple. It begins with an open-air court fronting the river, then a pylon shaped like a flat-topped pyramid, with colossal statues standing in front. Passing the threshold, one enters a columned court decorated with statues of the king, then a vestibule, and finally the hidden sanctuary. In blueprint form, the temple is relatively straightforward. The catch, though, was the material. Instead of building this temple in stone blocks dragged from quarries, the temple itself was the quarry. Working in reverse, the builders were going to fashion these sanctum, courts, pylons, and colossi out of the mountain itself. This was not a unique approach. Rulers like Hatshepsut and Horemheb had commissioned such rock-cut temples previously. But as with so many of their projects, Ramesses and his architects did this on a much grander scale. Today, Abu Simbel is dominated by two sanctuaries. We know them as the Great or Large Temple and the Small or Petite Temple. In antiquity, their names were a bit more evocative. The Great Temple was called Per Ramesses Meri-Imen, or the House of Ramesses, Beloved of Amun. In late Egyptian, you might pronounce that as Pai-Ramessesa Mai Amana. The small temple was called, well, we don't actually have a name for that one. The inscriptions in the monument do not give the little temple its own distinct identity. That probably tells us something about the religious boundaries. Although they are two separate sanctuaries, the great and small temples are part of a shared complex, united in purpose and dedication, and sharing a single name. This is all the domain of Ramesses. As for the gods dwelling in these temples, well, that's a bit more complicated. There are a lot of deities named and depicted in the halls of Abu Simbel. I'll just introduce the big players. The first deity you meet when you visit the Great Temple is the sun god Ra, specifically Ra Hor Akti, or Ra, the Horus of the horizons. He appears on the facade in the very center, between the colossal statues. Here, an image of the god, as a human male with a falcon head, emerges from the rock. He wears a sun disk as a crown, and he clutches two scepters. In his left hand, the god holds a symbol of the deity Ma'at, the goddess of order, truth, reality. In his right hand, Ra clutches a staff with a jackal head. This is the hieroglyph Osir, or power. Classic symbols, but they combine to make something cool. If you add the two scepters together with the god Ra himself, you get Osir Ma'at Ra, the name of the king. So at the very center of the facade, as you approach the temple, you are confronted with the name of its builder. It's disguised in 3 dimensions within the statue, but it's there for those who know. Once you go inside, you will find a bewildering array of gods and goddesses. Starting at the very back, you have the inner sanctuary. It houses 4 statues. From right to left, when you are facing them, you have Ra Horakti, Ra the Horus of Horizons. Then, a statue of Ramesses himself, more on that in a moment. A statue of Amun Ra, the king of the gods, with his distinctive crown of plumes. Finally, there is a statue of Ptah, the master of thought, speech, and craftworking, a good god to honor in such a complex monument. For the rest of the temple, things get more elaborate. Across the walls, you can find at least 42 individual deities. There are images of Anpu, Anubis, Khnum, the ram who fashioned humanity, Ma'at, the cosmic order, Osir, Osiris, Ise, or Isis, Sekhmet, Sobek, Jehuti, or Thoth, Hathor, and Horus, and many, many more. The sanctuaries of Abu Simbel, the House of Ramesses, are home to a vast conclave of powerful beings. Among those many gods, there is also a new one, On the walls of Abu Simbel, you can find Ramesses making offerings to himself. He usually sits enthroned with other deities, wearing a sun disk as a crown. He also has a headdress, the nemes, and he often has ram's horns that connect him with a form of Amun, especially popular in Nubia. We also have images of the king's statue housed within a bark shrine, a portable boat carried by priests. The best example of this is in the sanctuary, where the king stands before his own bark, and he burns incense, making offerings to his divine image. That bark has a name. It is called the Boat of Ramesses, beloved of Amun, who dwells within the house of Amun. This self-worship was not new. Kings like Amenhotep III had done it quite explicitly in their own Nubian temples. It's quite a large topic that we'll explore in the future, but to make a long story quite short, Ramesses included himself as one of the gods honored within this temple. Abu Simbel is a truly remarkable monument. But how was it made? The construction probably started early in the first decade of Ramesses' reign. We don't have an exact date for the temple's conception. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, the temples of Abu Simbel and several others in Nubia were physically relocated to rescue them from the rising waters of Lake Nasser. As a result, much of the archaeological context for these temples is lost, now buried beneath mud, sediment, and an enormous lake. As a result, a huge amount of information that we might have learned about the construction is irretrievably lost. That being said, there are a couple of clues that suggest an early start date. For one thing, on the facade of the temple, with those giant seated statues, you can find smaller figures standing next to the king. These include images of his wife, Nefertari, his mother, Tuya, and several of his children. Notably, the children that appear on the facade of the temple are all Ramesses' eldest sons and daughters, younglings like Amun Kherkopeshef and Bint Anat, the firstborn prince and princess, and their immediate siblings. That doesn't confirm a date, but it suggests that work started early in the reign, when these were the most prominent children, and before they started dying in later decades. So, first years of the reign, give or take, for the temple's conception. Once the project started, we do have a bit more information. For one thing, we have a reasonably good idea of the manager. The Viceroy of Nubia, named Iuni, left an inscription at Abu Simbel marking his participation in the project. You can find it just next to the small temple, the one dedicated to Nefertari. It is on the northern side, to your right, when you face that monument directly. The carving is a horizontal rectangle. On the left, the king Ramesses sits enthroned with an elaborate crown on his head. To the right, Iuni stands before the king. The viceroy is depicted modestly, in an ankle-length robe and holding a crook, or heka, meaning rule, and he clutches an ostrich feather fan, and hieroglyphs record his dedication for Ramesses. Quote, "The king's son of Kush says to the pharaoh, 'May your father, Amun-Ra, endow you with life, stability, and dominion. May he grant you eternity as king of the two lands, the everlasting ruler of the 9 bows. Made by the king's son of Kush, Iuni, the man from Khenennesut.'" End quote. The stela is surprisingly brief. In fact, there's a lot of blank space, sections that Iuni could have filled with art or hieroglyphs, like dedications or a biography, but he didn't. That may sound trivial, but it does potentially give us some clues. Iuni might have commissioned the stela shortly before he died. The sculptors would have prepared the rock face, drafted the scenes in ink, and then started to carve it. But if that process took time, or if the artists were doing a little bit of work here, a little bit there, the stela may have been in progress when the viceroy passed away. Again, that is speculative, but the fact that such an important official left such a prominent rock carving totally unfinished is quite noteworthy. Assuming Iuni did die shortly after Abu Simbel was started, what happened to the building management? Well, another stela might give us the clue. Iuni's stela appears next to the small temple, the one dedicated to Nefertari. If you go back to the Great Temple on its left or southern side, you can find another royal official leaving his mark. This stela comes from a man named Ashur-Hebsed, or Millions of Said Festivals. A weirdly sycophantic name, but that is quite common in this period. Ashur-Hebsed had worked for King Seti I as a troop commander and a diplomat, or king's messenger to foreign lands. In those roles, he had led mining expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula in search of turquoise and copper. So Ashur was experienced in people management, organizing soldiers and laborers far from home. He was also a diplomat, so he probably knew how to deal with foreigners and negotiations. That was under Seti I. Following Ramesses' accession, Ashur-Hebsed received another promotion. First, the new king appointed him as Chief of the Bodyguards, or Heri Shemsu, a plum position close to the ruler and responsible for his personal safety. Ashur-Hebsed does not mention this in his monuments, but the title of Chief of Bodyguards probably means that he was present at the Battle of Kadesh, perhaps even leading the Sherden or Sea Peoples, whom Ramesses shows in his entourage. I'm speculating there, but this official was professionally close to the king, and he had titles related to the royal physical safety. It makes sense that he would join those military expeditions. Anyway, Ramesses also demonstrated his great trust in Ashur-Hebsed by making him a Webar Nesu, or King's Cupbearer. This was an old title. Originally, it had been what it sounds like, a person who carries the cup for the king and thus is trustworthy to not slip poison or to murder the ruler. Over time, the cupbearer seems to have stopped being an actual physical role and more of an honorific title, but it marked the trustworthiness of an individual and their close physical proximity to the king. Put all of that together, and we get an idea of Ashur-Hebsed as an official. He had military experience leading expeditions into the desert. He had been a diplomat, and he was probably familiar with battle, being the chief of bodyguards around the time of Kadesh. Now he was close to Ramesses himself, probably one of the most publicly trusted officials in the court. With that in mind, I imagine Ashur-Hebsed as a kind of fixer, a problem solver, an enforcer, a man who gets things done. It's an impression that Ashur-Hebsed himself was eager to foster. On a rock stela next to the Great Temple at Abu Simbel, he left the following report. Quote, "His person, the king, was alert in seeking out every excellent deed, in performing good things for his father, Horus, the lord of Meha, that is, the god of Abu Simbel, in making for him his temple of millions of years, it being excavated in the mountain of Meha, Abu Simbel. Never had the like been done previously, only by the son of Amun, the lord of renown in all lands, Ramesses. He, the king, carried off numerous people as the capture of his strong arm from every foreign country. He filled the estates of the gods with the children of Syria, and the royal cupbearer Ashur-Hebsed was charged to inspect the land of Cush with the victorious arm of his person." End quote. A lot of that is rhetoric, but it does include 3 pieces of valuable information. First, Ashur-Hebsed describes the Temple of Abu Simbel as a Chot Chechu Renput, or Temple of Millions of Years. That is usually the designation for a mortuary temple, the sanctuaries dedicated to individual kings, in their lifetime and after their death. We often think of rulers having just one mortuary or memorial temple, but they could actually have multiple. Ramesses had one of these in Waset, near the Valley of the Kings, but also in Abydos, and probably one near Men-Nefer, or Memphis. Apparently, Abu Simbel was also designated as a memorial temple. Secondly, Ashahebsed mentions slaves, captives brought from Syria, or Retjenu, which would fill the estates of the gods. Presumably, these prisoners worked on farms, orchards, vineyards, and as porters, laborers, and manufacturers. We'll come back to slavery as a concept, and its nuances, in a future episode. For now, Ashahebsed gives a rare record of the captive economy and work under Ramesses II. Finally, the official mentions his role as a fixer. Apparently, Ashahebsed was charged to, quote, inspect the land of Kush with the victorious arm of his person. That phrase, the victorious arm, is a specific one. It refers to an expedition, usually military, conducted on the king's behalf, but one that the ruler does not attend in person. Apparently, Ashahebsed led one of these. It's unclear if he means a military expedition, perhaps to quell an uprising or expand the borders, or if he simply means a force of soldiers and laborers coming to do work. Ashahebsed does not give a date for this inspection, but it was probably after the death of Iuni, the viceroy. Maybe in the ensuing power vacuum there was instability in Nubia, and the king wanted it dealt with. Or maybe there had been an uprising. Or maybe Ramesses just sent a trusted official to ensure the business side of things stayed orderly. The fact that this inscription is at Abu Simbel specifically, instead of any other temple or city in Nubia, might indicate that Ashahebsed was dispatched to inspect the work. Get things on track, as it were. Sadly, officials like Iuni and Ashahebsed, with their brief and vague inscriptions, are the only testimonies for the construction of Abu Simbel. Overall, we really don't hear anything about the construction as a whole. Aside from minor hiccups, like Iuni's death, we also don't hear about disruptions or issues in the process. While absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, it may have been a relatively straightforward project. Certainly, the actual construction would have been slow, careful, but not too complicated. How long did it all take? Again, we don't have firm evidence here, but based on the inscriptions within the monument and the royal children who appear on its walls, the Great Temple was probably finished around year 25 of the king's reign. It was definitely finished by year 34, when the king's representatives started changing parts of its decoration and adding new inscriptions. Some of those changes actually included dates, so we can pinpoint when they occurred. We'll come back to some of that in the future. The point is, Abu Simbel, the Great Temple, probably took about 20 years to quarry, carve, and decorate. That might seem surprisingly slow, but we should remember, Ramesses commissioned dozens of temples along the Nile Valley. These were located all throughout northern Nubia and most of Egypt itself. And Abu Simbel is quite unusual in that it wasn't built in stone blocks, but rather quarried out of a mountain. With that in mind, most of the work had to be done by stonecutters, specialist masons with high-quality tools and a great deal of experience. So the team that excavated Abu Simbel and decorated it were probably quite specialized. Even on a good year, the skilled masons would have been in short supply, as the teams were stretched across a huge number of monuments. With that in mind, 20 years actually doesn't seem that unreasonable. Imagine them working in a stop-start fashion as work crews rotated between different sites. Officially, the project was led by the Viceroy of Nubia, first Iuni, and then one of his successors. Occasionally, Ramesses had to dispatch an agent to inspect the project and ensure smooth operations. Men like Asha Hebzed, the chief of bodyguards and cupbearer, saw to that business. Over the course of decades, these specialized work crews and their leaders gradually got the job done. Now, there is one last feature that I should mention. It concerns a phenomenon that occurs in Abu Simbel. Twice a year, in February and October, sunlight shines directly through the entrance of the Great Temple. It passes along the hypostyle and inner halls and enters the sanctuary. There, the sunlight shines upon 3 statues, the images of Ra-Horakhti, Ramesses himself, and Amun-Ra. The figure of Ptah on the southern side remains in darkness. The solar alignment draws great curiosity. Apparently, crowds throng to Abu Simbel on the respective days. I've never witnessed it personally, but I hear it's impressive, rather meditative in its silent splendor. Why does this phenomenon happen? Or more accurately, why does this alignment happen on these particular days? The popular explanation that you'll hear from most tour guides is that the solar alignment occurs on 2 days important to Ramesses. The first is his birthday, the second his date of coronation. Is that true? Well, to be perfectly honest, we don't know. Within the temples themselves, you will not find any hieroglyph inscription or artistic scene that mentions this alignment, nor do they reference any particular date that might be significant. If it is intentional, we don't know what the date is supposed to mark. But that is not particularly satisfying, so let's explore the hypotheticals. Firstly, the birthday and coronation. In this case, we are largely dealing with folklore. The birthday of Ramesses II is unknown. The date that he became king after the death of his father was the 3rd month of Shemu, day 27. This was celebrated as an annual festival, and it would have occurred in late June or early July. As for his coronation, that also does not have a particular date. In fact, the king probably didn't practice one single coronation ceremony, but he might have had several, appearing at different temples before different gods to receive crowns and blessings. It's a whole thing that I've discussed previously. The point is, the birthday, accession date, and coronation date, all of those are speculative at best, and they really don't have any solid basis for connection with the alignment. Other explanations have focused on festivals. For example, one idea is that the alignment is supposed to mark the king's jubilee, his Hebsed or Sed festival, in the 30th year of his reign. That was first argued by scholars like Louis Christophe and Jan Hagen in the 1960s, later picked up by Robert Boval in 2008, and repeated in 2023 by Goran Henriksson. Very briefly, the argument goes that based on the dates of later Sed festivals, the one in year 30 happened in the first month of Peret, which would be around February. Hypothetically, the architects who planned Abu Simbel used astronomical observation and simple mathematics to figure out the relevant date on which the sun would shine into the sanctuary. This one is possible. At the very least, we do know that the Sed festival was a significant occasion, and some of those jubilees are dated in the written record. Unfortunately, it does have issues. Firstly, as scholar Kenneth Kitchen pointed out, the temple itself has no visible connection with the Sed festival. You won't find images of the Jubilee or any reference to it in the art or hieroglyphs. What's more, that stela of Ashahebsed actually calls Abu Simbel a memorial temple, a temple of millions of years, rather than a Jubilee temple. So in terms of what's in the monument itself, the Sed festival idea is speculative at best. Another interpretation connects Abu Simbel's alignment with a fertility festival. In 2021, a researcher named Kyle Wayburn argued that the temple was aligned to mark the festival of Koyak. This was an annual celebration linked to the death and resurrection of Osir, Osiris, and partially celebrating the appearance of the flood. This argument also has some points going for it. For one thing, the Koyak festival is well documented in the days of Ramesses II. Secondly, the connections with Osiris would fit with the mortuary temple aspect of Abu Simbel itself. And finally, we know that the date of the Koyak festival was the fourth month of Akhet, days 21 to 30. Roughly speaking, that is late October in the Gregorian calendar. So the solar illumination would have happened in the very middle of the Koyak festival. Unfortunately, the Egyptian calendar was not perfectly aligned with the solar cycle. They marked 365 days to a year, instead of the 365 and 1/4 that the Earth requires to orbit the Sun. So ancient Egyptian days and festivals tended to drift slightly over time. With that in mind, scholars always have to make assumptions about particular years and chronology to line things up. So while the Koyak interpretation has merit, it is another one of those possible but unconfirmed ideas. Ultimately, the best we can say is that the choice of these dates in February and October does not have a satisfactory explanation. We can guess that the alignment itself is intentional, more on that in a moment. But why did they choose those days in particular? Unknown. The simplest explanation might be that one of those dates, in February or October, was the date at which the temple was originally planned and aligned. When they started work on a monument, like a temple or a pyramid, ancient Egyptian architects would use astronomical and solar observations to make sure everything was aligned. It's possible that the reason the sunlight shines on those particular dates is simply to mark the foundation of the temple itself. For now, we really don't know, until excavations at some other temple or settlement bring up a reference to the illumination. Researchers are stuck with educated guesses at best. That may be terribly unsatisfying, but it is what it is. Fortunately, the meaning of the illumination is much easier to understand. The entrance of sunlight along the temple axis and illuminating the statues within had a potent magical effect. Ancient Egyptian statues were not just works of art or sculpture, they were also physical bodies for the being they depicted. Such bodies were, in their own way, alive. The ancients called them living images, or tut ankh. And the sunlight that entered the sanctuary brought life to those bodies. In that sense, the illumination connected the physical sun, Ra, with his statue, and that of his son, Ramesses, and the god Amun-Ra. These solar beings, enthroned in the sanctuary, received their rejuvenating light twice a year. The fourth statue, Ptah, did not. Even before the temple was moved in the 1960s, the solar alignment only touched the shoulder of Ptah's statue. For the most part, this god sits in darkness. Physically, that seems to be intentional. The builders could have widened the door to the sanctuary to allow the sunlight in for that deity. But they didn't, and there's no evidence that Ptah's statue was added later or anything. So apparently, the god is meant to be in darkness. Why? Well, it's probably religious. Ptah had many roles: artisan, master of thought, creator. But by the age of Ramesses II, Ptah had also acquired connections with the earth and the Duat, or underworld. Ptah could appear as the creative deity Ptah Ta-Tenen, or Ptah the risen land, and as the falcon Ptah Sokar. Both of these gods were connected with the night and the rejuvenation of the earth and the life cycle. With that in mind, Ptah was becoming a deity who often dwelled in darkness. By placing his statue off the main axis, the god was in his proper abode, so to speak, but he still received a sliver of sunlight, giving him rejuvenation and connection to Ra. He just didn't need the full dazzlement. In religious terms, that may explain the shadow. Again, there are no hieroglyphs to explain this more specifically, but given the nature of Ptah, that is the best current explanation. So, twice a year, the sun's light entered the sanctuary and connected the statues of Ra-Horakti, Ramesses, and Amun-Ra with their celestial counterpart, and Ptah received a little bit too. Whether the particular dates of the alignment have a special significance remains uncertain, but the meaning is clear. The warmth and light of the sun was a blessing, rejuvenating the stone bodies of these divine beings. Abu Simbel is a wonderfully complex temple. Officially, it is the House of Ramesses, beloved of Amun, and from at least one record, it may have functioned as one of the king's numerous memorial temples. It is also home to many deities, more than 40 in total, including powerful gods like Ra-Horakti, Horus, specifically the local manifestation, Amun-Ra, Ptah, Hathor, Sekhmet, and many more. So it's not just a temple for the king, but a home for many of Egypt and Nubia's deities to dwell in the sacred mountain. Of course, this temple also has a political function, demonstrated most immediately by that facade. The colossal statues of the king and the image of Ra-Horakti in the center stare out eastward over the river Nile. First and foremost, these massive images communicate a sense of power, and for passers-by or visitors, they are clearly meant to elicit a response. Fear, awe, admiration, obedience. Any who saw the temple from their tiny boats on the Nile would face the colossi from as low a position it was possible to get. You can see this in old photos. Before the temple was relocated, the mountain and colossi genuinely loomed over the river's edge. Combine that with a worldview that treated Ramesses, and by extension his stone image, as a living god, a being capable of overwhelming all lands. The facade of Abu Simbel communicated power above all. Divinely sanctioned power that came from the greatest of gods, gods who bestowed their blessings directly on the king when they illuminated his statues, both outside and in. Beyond Ramesses himself, the temple also communicates the strength of the Egyptian king as a concept, the living Horus, the son of Osiris, the heir to Ra, seated on the throne of the living, the god who stamps his authority over all foreign lands. It is that eternal being, in the current incarnation of Ramesses II, who sits at the edge of the river, communicating his majesty to countless generations. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. This is just a brief introduction to the great temple of Abu Simbel. We will visit the small temple for Queen Nefertari in the future. If you are interested in books about Abu Simbel, there are many. Probably the best one in terms of detailed but also accessible is a 2020 book called Abu Simbel and the Nubian Temples by Nigel Fletcher Jones. It introduces both the great and small temples, the deities that appear in them, and the other monuments in Nubia constructed by Ramesses and other rulers. It's a great introduction to these temples and their overall significance, so I recommend that. Before I go, I would like to extend a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon. In particular, I'd like to thank the priests, who help sustain my very non-divine person with offerings and allow me to fund my personal house. My house is much smaller than Abu Simbel, but that's probably for the best. Special thanks to Karen, Eryan, Siyin, Dan, Erin, Kate, Carlos, James, Chris, Suyon, Setnacht, Jean, James B, Daniel S, Ashley, Veronica, TJ, Nadine, Andy and Chelsea, Yola, Mycost, Terry, Eric, and Linda. Folks, you are all too generous. May Ra Horakti, Ramesses the god, and Amun Ra, Lord of Nubia, protect you and your loved ones, and ensure that light shines upon you and your loved ones on special occasions in the year. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you soon.